this section. Okay, so everyone, we're very happy to greet you and invite you to our last of the fall lectures in the Literary Connection series with Mark Schenker. Those of you who don't know Mark, I want to say a couple of words about him. He has been at Yale College since 1990, and he is currently a Senior Associate Dean of the College and Dean of Academic Affairs. A former lecturer in the English department, he received his Ph.D. from Columbia University with concentration in the 19th century and early 20th century English literature. Dean Schenker has over 25 years lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion series in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries, museums, and cultural centers. And okay, welcome, Mark, and please take it away.
Thank you. And a couple of explanations. One is that my preference always, and the reason I got into leading book discussions, in fact, the reason I got into college teaching of literature, is because I like talking with my students and patrons, not just at them. But there's a concession being made, of course, to this format. So I'm going to be talking at you more than is my wont. But let me say that I'll break at about 15 or 20 minutes roughly to try to take questions essentially about what I just presented. And I'll do that at the half point and 3/4 and so on. Let me say that if it happens that you have more questions and comments that I can entertain in the hour that we're Zooming, I am earnest when I say you can send me an email. Kate will give you my email address, and I will do my best to answer you promptly. Won't be tonight, but very promptly, even though the answer may well be, I don't know. So again, talking more at you than usual. This is a magnificent novel. I hope you had a chance to read it. I want to say if you did not have a chance to read it, you're of course welcome. But I want to stress that in my condensed presentation, I may make the novel seem more schematic than it is. And the one thing that it is not is schematic. It is a remarkably nuanced and delicate novel about character portrayal, especially the three main characters. And it is a sumptuously, elegantly detailed novel about the trappings of the New York society in the Gilded Age. The novel set in the period between 1870s and just before the First World War. It is set in the period of the adulthood of Edith Wharton's parents, which was a new turn for her in 1920 when the book was published, because her earlier novels had been more or less contemporaneous with her own adult life. And I'll explain why she did that. Her dates are 1862 to 1937, so born before one great American war and died before another, but she lived through the First World War, and that war was instrumental in determining this kind of book, The Age of Innocence. She was born Edith Newbolt Jones to a wealthy and socially connected family in New York. That is the origin, it is believed, of the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. So she was just that wealthy. But she was born with a great intelligence and literary gift, and she recognized very early that, like some of her heroes and heroines, she could see a life beyond the life that was determined for her. But unlike many of those literary characters, she actually got out of that life. So a little bit about her bibliography. She was writing from her teenage years, and she saw first success at the age of 43. She was already married, with The House of Mirth, another masterpiece. I'm a great Edith Wharton fan. And as that title suggests, it's a kind of satirical or ironic novel that has an element of tragedy in the life of Lily Bart, the heroine of that novel, who is another character who is born into a life that she doesn't want to be in, but has no recourse to another life. That's 1905. Then she published Ethan Frome in 1911. a different kind of setting, but the same kind of attention to cues, character, and social conventions that is the bane, I understand, of many middle school and high school students. Unfortunately, for many of them, it's the only Edith Wharton they encounter pre-college, and that's unfortunate. Then she published The Custom of the Country in 1913. The country is America, the custom is money, and that's a very broadly satirical novel. The heroine of that novel is named Undine, Undine. You may have relatives with that name, Undine Sprague. What matters is that her initials are the same as United States. And it's a very broadly satirical novel about American class and culture. And then the First World War happened. And she was living in France for many years before and until her death. And she was horrified that the Western civilization that she had been ironic or sarcastic or satirical about in her fiction had almost been destroyed. And she felt that she owed an apology to the world of her forebears, especially her parents, who lived bound in an age of innocence, that is, an age before the war, when they were constrained in a world of social cues and silent communication that she started for the first time to take seriously. And so she considered The Age of Innocence her apology for the House of Mirth. Now, because it's literature, we can enjoy both books. They are both terrific books. But The Age of Innocence is meant to go back in time. Again, she was born in the 1860s. It's set in the late 1870s, and try to contemplate what three different people would do in the constraints of a society that sees poverty as error or sin and sees their greatness based in commerce. Beaufort, who goes under, is a victim of what was called the Long Depression, which took place in America from 1873 to 1879, several recessions, depressions before the great one in the 30s. Their society is based on commerce, but they treat themselves like aristocrats. It's a very closed and powerful society. I recommend to you, if you've never seen it or haven't seen it recently, the splendid 1993 movie directed by Martin Scorsese, with the three leads, fantastically played, beautifully directed. I could not be more earnest when I say, if you haven't seen it recently, see it again. It is a magnificent movie, and it captures perfectly the silent deadliness of the society, the near tragedy. I say near tragedy because in my own view, Newland Archer doesn't quite rise to the level of a tragic hero. We can talk about that possibly in discussion. But Scorsese said famously that he thinks it was the most violent movie he ever directed. And he knew just what he meant, because people think of his blood-shedding movies. And this is a movie, as the narrator says, where the taking of life happens without a fusion of blood, just as deadly as a gang movie and a kind of gang, but in a elegant setting. It's really a terrific experience to watch that movie. So one thing that happens, this first unit of my talk is about the broader context of the book. One thing that happened in the 1870s, 80s, 90s in Europe and America is that literary artists got interested in writing tragedies or near tragedies where people were not the victims of fate, as in Greek tragedy, or of the gods, but of society. That society, in a number of very well-known literary works in those decades, takes on the control and the force of nemesis or Greek drama or fate. We see it not just in this novel, we see it in The Age of Innocence, we see it in almost all the works of Ibsen, who's writing at the end of the century, especially in Hedda Gabler, where she's done in by social convention or a dollhouse. We see it in something like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, where people are constrained not by fate and not even by their social circumstances, but by their powerlessness to deal with those circumstances, a kind of stranglehold on independence and character. So the protagonist of the book, early and late, we see him first at an opera, watching both the opera, Faust, and watching the box that May is in, and later Ellen enters. And he's very much a watcher throughout the novel, Newland Archer. His name, he has his last name in common with Isabelle Archer, Henry James's great heroine, A Portrait of a Lady, published in 1881. Henry James and Edith Wharton were great friends. He was something of a mentor to her. She thought that she might follow him as an American moving to the continent in order to write about Europe, and he discouraged her. Some people think he didn't want the competition. I actually take him at his word that he thought she would do better working what she knew as a member of a very wealthy and socially connected family, which he was not. He did not have that kind of social status. So he encouraged her to stay in America and write about New York, and she did. I am certain that she took the name Archer with Isabelle Archer in mind. In both characters, the last name Archer, and May is an archer for part of the book. She wins a little prize for being an excellent archer. And it was one of those activities that women could actually, polite, genteel women could actually participate in because you didn't sweat. It wasn't strenuous. In both cases, the name suggests a kind of activity, kind of energy that Newland, of course, does not have. And his first name, Newland, and you might have noticed that, or you might not, it is a nod towards the idea that he seems restless in this world. And if he were wired differently, he would break out into another world. You see at the end that he suggested he might go to India or Japan because he needs a break. This is what he actually says. And then his wife, in a stunning passage and beautifully directed, magnificently directed, Winona Ryder won great acclaim for the part, sticks the virtual dagger in him by saying, well, Ellen has gone back to Europe and her husband because she shared with Ellen that May was going to have a baby. It's a kind of motif in American literature for quite serious works of literary fiction to use names that reflect a kind of symbolic dimension, even though the novels may not be symbolic. You see this in something like Arthur Dimmesdale in The Scarlet Letter, or in Portrait of a Lady. Her husband, Isabel's husband, is Gilbert Osmond, O-S-M-O-N-D, which means bony world or fossilized or ossified world. One of her suitors in that book is a fellow named Caspar Goodwood. It turns out he's very virile, so I'll leave it to you to figure out the meaning of his last name. You would think, looking from the outside, that these are comic or jokey novels. They're not, but it's a long tradition. Moby Dick, Call Me Ishmael, and that's a name that resonates with the Old Testament. And so we see the same thing in May Welland. She's another name that has land in it, so her last name can be read as Welland. Maybe that she's happy where she is, as opposed to her husband, who would seek a new land if he had the guts. And her first name, May, captures, like the name Daisy in Daisy Buchanan or Daisy Miller, a kind of freshness. She's young. Winona Ryder was in her early 20s and nailed the performance. And what characterizes May, I said that Newland is a watcher, a kind of voyeur. He has a name that suggests athletic activity and a keen eye, but he really turns out to be someone who keeps his distance early and late, and who might best be seen as a failed rebel. He has that mix that is often the mix of tragedy, although again, I think it stops short of tragedy in his case. He is smart enough to recognize how he is caught in the system, but he is not committed enough to break out of it. And if he were more emotionally complicated, he would be tortured. He's not quite tortured, I think. I think it's more sympathetic to the complexities of the world and doesn't take the kind of extremity of torture. In any event, he's a failed rebel. May, by contrast, the fresh, well-land, happy where she is an entirely conventional character. She's unimaginative, but not stupid. And she is fluent in the coded language of the society. And that's what matters. He gets it, he sees it, but she speaks it. And the way she uses her knowledge of what's going on with her first fiance and then her husband, how she reads that he's an honorable man, how she knows that Ellen's commitment to her as a cousin means some things will just not be done. She is brilliant in the way she uses what she knows as a conventional character. And then Ellen, with the name Olenska, quite different from the name of the two American names, is of course given a Polish name from her husband, and she's absolutely an unconventional character who has both an emotional depth that she brings out in Archer, but also an intelligence that we don't see at all in May. And one way to think of the three characters, and I think this novel is very autobiographical, in Edith Wharton trying to plot her life on the register of what she knew her parents had to go through. I think Newland Archer can be seen as what Edith Wharton feared she would become if she didn't break out of society. She had an affair. More importantly, she became a writer. There's a passage in the novel that I hope you remember where they talk about the New York Society of People Who Wrote, artists, musicians, and people who wrote. And they make the point that people go to museums and go to the opera because it shows a kind of taste, but they're not really people who read. Many characters who are very powerful in the society have no interest in literature. And the narrator, and in the movie, the narrator is Joanne Woodward off camera, and she does a terrific job. The narrator in the novel says that the world of those who wrote and the world of good society are both small, but they seem not to be able to merge. Edith Wharton is showing the disdain for literary writers by the world, the society in the novel. And what those writers have, which the novel's narrator fails to acknowledge, is imagination. And so how Edith Wharton got out is through her imagination. I think we can see May Welland as what her society and her family wanted Edith Wharton to be. And then I think we can see Ellen as the kind of intelligent, emotional person that Edith Wharton was able to cultivate in herself and in her work. So having said that as a kind of, I hope, helpful overview, and seeing that we're at the 1/3 point, I'll stop to see if there are questions or comments. And I want to underscore, I especially welcome questions or comments about what I just said, so that if you don't have any, I can move forward. And if you do, it helps clarify the first part of the lecture. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Mark. I don't see any raised hands or any questions so far, so I think that you may move forward, and we'll see if we have any questions later on.
Thanks very much. And as is my habit, I'm not going into extensive detail about Edith Wharton's biography. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and back at the beginning, I would have to do that because people didn't have easy access. Now people can look up anything, so you can flesh out her biography. Again, It looks back into the period of her parents' generation in the 1870s. It has a kind of nostalgia for pre-war innocence, even as it recognizes how that innocence was complicated. Newland Archer shares several of Edith Wharton's traits. He's literate, and he has a detached anthropological eye for the manners of his own tribe. He understands the society that he's in. And if he had more energy, if he had more guts, he might actually become a critic, a writer, a commenter on the society that he knew. So despite his strong attraction to the newly, quote, escaped from marriage, Ellen, he marries May and finds himself stifled by the demands of domesticity. May is complacent within the world of the glacial social surface of old New York, the nuances, the silences. At one point in the novel, the narrator speaks of the fact that there's a kind of hieroglyphic world in the social set of old New York that's on a continuum with that of primitive man. That's a lot, those are the phrases there. In reality, they all lived in a kind of hieroglyphic world where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. When he's in Paris at the end with his son Dallas, who's arranged for them to see Ellen after all these years, 26 years since the relationship ended. Newland is 57, and the son makes the connection off camera, off stage, and the father does not. The son says to the father, you and mother never really spoke. You did everything through a kind of code. And then he says, and yet you probably communicated more than my generation communicates without actually talking. And that's Wharton's nod to the talent, the sort of tragic talent of these people who are making accommodations to a system that crushes expression, that erases expression. So lots of nuances and silence. As I said, Ellen is ejected from the society without a fusion of blood, without a confrontation. And it's worth thinking again in the broader context of the literary scene that this is one of several novels of the 20s. And we're doing Edith Wharton this evening. There's always a good reason to do Edith Wharton. But this series is looking back 100 years later on the 1920s. This novel was published in the 1920s. In our last meeting, we looked at Henrietta Lacks, a nonfiction book about a woman born in 1920. And in the meeting before that in September, we read the first mystery novel by P.D. James, who herself was born in the 1920. And in 1920, I'll preview next semester's 1920s book. It joins some other novels that are not obviously about the First World War, but this is very much a post-war novel in the recognition of a kind of pre-modern violence. There are lots of metaphors about Newland being a captor, being defeated by an army, that a fusion without blood. And it joins work like The Great Gatsby, which is very much a post-World War I novel, or The Wasteland, 1922. Mrs. Dalloway, that we're doing in the spring, is a novel that has a character who is a traumatized vet. It doesn't make a whole lot of reference to the war, but the entire book is suffused by a post-World War I mentality. You could say the same thing about Ulysses, published in 1922, set in 1904. It is a distinctly post-World War I novel. That may be a topic for another series. So Newland is unable to take action on his own, even at the end, now widowed, middle-aged, given a kind of entree by his oldest son. He can't summon up the initiative to call on Ellen in Paris, which is now just before the Great War. His self-entrapment, his fealty to a powerful social code of people that he sees as narrow-minded is more than satire and less than tragedy. I think it resides in that very delicate spot where he's not made fun of, but I don't think he quite rises to tragic grandeur. It's a somber and sympathetically delineated portrait of a life only half led, which is the substance of much great literature, lives only half led. It is often seen as her most controlled piece of writing. It won her the Pulitzer Prize, the first woman ever to do so. It is not as moving as The House of Mirth, which is a fantastically emotional and, in my view, tragic novel. And it's not as satirically exuberant as The Custom of the Country. And so if you wanted to make a good mini tutorial in the novels of Edith Wharton, reading those three books in the order of publication, The House of Mirth, The Custom of the Country, and this novel, The Age of Innocence, would move you from sympathetic, tragic satire to rollicking satire to the book, this book as I just described it. I noted that the book begins with not just at the opera Faust, and of course, Newland is someone who doesn't have the wherewithal to sell his soul to the devil. He's not that kind of bargain maker, but he is a watcher, again, a voyeur, not in the sexual sense, but in the sense of getting a satisfaction at a distance. You remember when he goes to fetch Ellen, he sees her at the pier watching the sailboat go by, and he just stands there and watches her watch in the same direction that she's looking, and then he goes back. He doesn't engage with her. He's watching a watcher. At the opera, he watches both the opera and he watches May watching the opera. And some of the other men are watching him watch May watch the opera, and so on. This sort of socially distanced world before there was COVID is part of the hallmark of the Age of Innocence. So it begins with one show, that is the opera, Faust. And then when his son invites him to come up with him, when they figure out what floor Ellen is on by the fancier windows, in the novel, it's the 5th floor. In the movie, it's the 3rd floor, go figure. But anyway, we're told that he, Archer, remained motionless, gazing at the upper window as if the end of their pilgrimage had been attained. So gazing is a word you find very often in James Joyce. It's kind of looking without connecting. It's a kind of distant looking, almost if you're stupefied. And of course, the narrator saying the end of their pilgrimage had been attained by his just looking at the window. The son is surprised that his father won't come up. And the son says as an excuse, I'll say you're old fashioned and that you prefer walking up 5 flights because you don't like lifts. And in the movie and in the novel, Newland says, just say I'm old fashioned, that's enough. And Dallas goes up, and then I'm going to read to you the last few paragraphs of the novel, and you'll understand that I'm skipping to the end to make the point of how the novel is bookmarked by Newland watching a show, one an actual show, one a figurative show. And if you are planning to read the novel and haven't before, or if you're partly through, or you have an interest in someday rereading the novel, you might keep your eye out for how often he's a watcher. So he pictured Dallas entering that room with his quick, assured step and highly delightful smile, and wondered if the people were right who said his boy took after him. So this is an amazing thing. He's able to imagine the scene that he's not in. In almost all literary fiction that I know, and when I say literary fiction, I'm not being snobbish. I mean, not genre novels, not westerns or romances or detective stories, all good. but novels where the characters are meant to be seen with the complexity of humanity. It's always a good sign when someone has that ability to imagine. He can imagine being in the room, and maybe the fact that he can imagine it is part of what makes him not go into the room. Maybe he'd be better off if he were less talented in that regard. Then he tried to see the persons already in the room, for probably at that sociable hour, there would be more than one. He knows his business. And among them, a dark lady, pale and dark, who would look up quickly, half rise, and hold out a long, thin hand with 3 rings on it. He thought she would be sitting in a sofa corner near the fire with azaleas banked behind her on a table. I want to say again, this is a remarkable passage. You always want to pay careful attention to when any character in a novel or a play has a dream, imagine something. And you want to be just as careful when they have a kind of daydream or this kind of extraordinary sending out of his perceptions into a room he's looking at only from the street level and from the outside. And then he says what I've just been saying, it's more real to me here than if I went up, which of course is part of his situation, that he would prefer to remember her in her absence rather than her presence. He suddenly heard him, I'm sorry, it's more real to me here than if I went up, he certainly heard himself say. And the fear lest that last shadow of reality should lose its edge kept him rooted to his seat as the minutes succeeded each other. It's more real if he keeps it in his memory at a distance. He sat for a long time on the bench in the thickening dusk, his eyes never turning from the balcony. At length, a light shone through the windows, and a moment later, a manservant came out on the balcony, drew up the awnings, and closed the shutters. That is to say, the curtain has come down. He can't watch anymore. Now, if it were a different kind of situation, he could still imagine what he's imagining. He could wait for his son, but he's a looker from a remove. And now that the window is no longer literally or figuratively available to him, the show is over. And the last paragraph is a single sentence. At that, as if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to his hotel. As with so much in the movie, Scorsese's direction and the expression on Daniel Day-Lewis's face is extraordinary. It's unspeakably sad, but sadness isn't always tragedy. And I do think the novel and Edith Wharton herself is tremendously sympathetic to the bind that Newland finds himself in, and of course is partly cooperating with. So I'll stop there at the sort of second unit to make sure again that if you have comments or questions, that we can try to modulate this into a kind of lecture discussion if possible. It's the kind of book, like most great books, that benefits from multiple points of view. I'm a very big believer, and this is why I do these book groups, that if you want to be a better reader, don't just read more books, spend more time with other readers, because you will learn things, including my learning from other people, from other readers that you can't learn on your own because you can't see what you can't see. So, Kate, how are we doing?
I don't see any raised hands. If anyone wants to comment or ask a question, please raise a hand and let me see. Okay. Henry James and Edith Wharton, were they both influenced by Freud? How do you see this in this book?
Yeah. I'm going to betray my ignorance. Freud is enormously influential over literature and the arts and culture and society. I myself am not much interested in that influence for reasons too complicated to mention here. So I will say I don't know, although it'd be easy to find out, whether either or both of them read Freud. Of course, their subject is half-lived lives. I mentioned that earlier. And they are looking at the way in which desire is constantly thwarted by forces outside of someone's American independence, right? They're both Americans. Henry James is a transplanted one. Edith Wharton is not. Henry James famously renounced his American citizenship and took on British citizenship at the beginning of the First World War, eschewing double citizenship to show his allegiance to the country at the time of war when England was more involved in than America. Edith Wharton was very upset that he gave up his American citizenship, and she felt that it was important in the face of the war having ended to reclaim her Americanness, which is part of the reason she wrote this novel. So to get back to the question, as writers who are writing about thwarted and half-lived lives, of course, they're going to tap into many of the things that Freud is writing about, whether they write about Freud or not. And of course, that's true of Shakespeare or Dickens. I remember in college sitting in a chemistry class where I was not pre-med, I was a science major at the time. The professor pointed out that the year that Priestley discovered oxygen, and one of the students asked quite seriously, what were people breathing before then? So they had oxygen before we knew it. We have Freud before we read him. I don't have a better answer than that, but I say again, and I don't mean this glibly, it'd be an easy thing to find out.
We have a comment, not so much a question. Edith Wharton had little sympathy for modernism and its credo of art for art's sake. Though published in 1920, The Age of Innocence stands far apart from James Joyce and T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. In the American literary canon, this novel signifies the end of the pre-modernist era.
Okay, so I'm glad you shared that comment. I'll leave people to process this as they like. I will say that one difference, who was the first writer that comment was about before James? Who was the first person mentioned? Kate?
Okay, James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, right? And
I thought there was someone mentioned earlier.
Henry James.
Yes, Henry James. So one difference is Henry James is writing, and he almost invented single-handedly what we've come to call oriented narration. That is, a few of his novels are first-person narrated, but you will likely misremember this novel as being narrated by Newland, because the camera, as it were, and remember, there weren't cameras in Shakespeare's day, that is movie cameras, but there are movie cameras in Edith Wharton's day, Henry James's day. And one of the things that's happened is that Henry James decides to suffuse his novels with character, not just by writing about them, but by writing through them. So we think of Isabelle Archer in our flawed memory as partly narrating her novel, which she doesn't, but we're in her head so much it seems that way. And the same thing with Newland. Henry James is interested in that. Edith Wharton, like many of the novelists who are going to be writing, including 20s writers like Virginia Woolf, who will be visiting next semester, and D.H. Lawrence and Conrad and Foster, she's writing in an effort to give society a knowledge of itself to make people better. James Joyce wants to do it in a different way. He's always a kind of category unto himself. But Virginia Woolf really hoped that the novel she wrote in her career, which almost exactly maps on to the period between the wars, she thought that if people read her novels and other novels well, wars could be avoided in the future. It sounds naive, but she absolutely believed it. James Joyce thought that by writing about what was wrong with Ireland, leaving Ireland, and for the rest of his life writing about nothing but Ireland, he earnestly believed that if he showed the Irish people what was wrong with them, their mindless enslavement to religion. He wasn't God. He didn't like the narrowness of the religion that got rid of sex and so much of human experience. He disliked the partisanship of the politics, so that you could be beaten up for wearing the wrong color shirt on a certain day. And he disliked the fact that they were so parochial and also alcoholic. He lamented that Dublin was not one of the great European capitals, which was not. And he actually believed that his literature, could wake the Irish populace up to what was wrong with them. They didn't take the message, and they didn't cotton to him until after he was dead, but he believed that. And D.H. Lawrence thought that his literature in the 20s and 30s would change the way human beings see the body. And the same thing with Conrad and Foster and Virginia Woolf. Edith Wharton is ahead of that group, but she fits into the same pattern where she hopes this novel will give a better understanding, the understanding that she herself took on after the First World War. She spent much time, energy, and money helping wounded soldiers in France after the First World War. So this wasn't just a dilettanteous kind of interest. She hoped that she would show them what she was seeing. And that's a great aspect of modernism. Authors writing because they think that literature can do what scripture used to do, teach people to lead better lives.
We have someone who wants to ask a question live. Meridar, I am unmuting you.
I wanted to ask if you could explain more about the theme of half-led lives, and why do Wharton and James, why are they so interested in the theme?
In that theme, yes, thank you. So, of course, what I mean by half-lived is that if you look at Newland as an acquaintance in his society, he makes a living as a lawyer. He's not a particularly industrious lawyer. He has children. He has a wife who is beautiful and elegant. He lives very well. His children seem to be well situated in the society that most people approve. We're told by the narrator, he honestly grieved his wife. If you know more about his story than a mere acquaintance would know, you would know that he escaped a scandal. And so you can say, this is a full life from the outside. But of course, it's not a full life from the point of view of the narrator of the novel, or the novelist, not the same person, or of Newland. We're told that he feels incredibly stifled and captive, and he's made his peace with it on one level, but he also feels that it's suffocating. And in fact, in one of the chapters, he gets up from reading and stands up impatiently, and she raises her head. They're married. This is late in the novel. If you give me a second, it's chapter 30. "What's the matter?" she says. "The room is stifling. I want a little air." He had insisted that the library curtains, there's curtains again, should draw backward and forward on a rod, so they can be closed in the evening instead of remaining nailed to a gilt cornice. So that idea of sliding lateral curtains is new. And he pulled them back and pushed up the sash, leaning out into the icy night. The mere fact of not looking at May seated beside his table under his lamp, the fact of seeing other houses, roofs, chimneys, of getting the sense of other lives outside his own, which is, of course, is exactly the work of a novelist, of someone with imagination, being able to see lives outside your own. And if you're a good reader of literary fiction, you get that gift often also. You get to see lives outside your own. Other cities beyond New York, and a whole world beyond his world. It cleared his brain, and it made it easier to breathe. After he had leaned out into the darkness for a few minutes, he heard her say, "Newland, do shut the window. You'll catch your death." Now, a perfectly reasonable response, but she has no idea what's going on in his head because he doesn't tell her. He pulled the sash down and turned back. Catch my death, he echoed. And he felt like adding, but of course he doesn't say this. He felt like adding, but I caught it already. I am dead. I've been dead for months and months. That's what I mean by half-lived life. And of course, his problem is he buries himself by feeling it, imagining he could say it, but not saying it. And that's his failure of not having the courage, the openness to talk more. And again, when I'm asked why is this so important to Henry James and Edith Wharton, they're living in a kind of society where things are just not said. They're understood and they're communicated, but again, by a kind of code, a kind of hieroglyphic. And again, the movie by Scorsese, the Edith Wharton has met her match, does that kind of signaling through body language and eye contact. The last 15 minutes of the movie and the scene in which May explains, apparently innocently, but they both know what she's doing, how she managed to get rid of Ellen by sharing the good news of her pregnancy before it was even actually known, is just fantastically directed. So that's what I mean, half-lived life. He can see more than he has, but he finds that he can't get it. And Kate, maybe I could add something here because I've said several times that it's not quite a tragedy. So when I talk about tragedy, when I teach ancient Greek drama, which I've done a lot of, or Shakespeare's tragedy, I give this example from Oedipus, one of the great original tragedies. As you'll remember, Oedipus has heard an oracle, a prophetess, tell him that he is doomed to kill his father at a place where three roads meet. That is like a kind of Y. And that he will marry, sleep with and marry his mother, which is a sin and a horror to the Greek mind, even greater than it would be, I think, to the modern American mind. So hearing this prophecy, he decides that he's going to run away from his mom and dad and therefore avoid his fate. He comes upon an area where three roads meet and it doesn't ring a bell. And he has an argument with a man who could be old enough to be his father, and he kills him. And he goes to a city down the road and finds out that the king of that city has been killed. He's a hero by solving a problem, and he gets to marry the widowed queen, who, booga booga, is his mother. That is, he runs away from fate to encounter his fate. Sophocles knew what he was doing. Now, you would say, as my students say, well, if he was fated to do this, how can he be blamed? Well, maybe if you hear the prophecy and believe it, don't kill anybody, or don't kill men the age that could be your father. Or if you're going to kill a guy who is old enough to be your father, do it where three roads don't meet, and don't marry widows. You know, you could make some rules of life that would help you to avoid it. But he is in the tragic nexus, and this is it. If hearing the prophecy, Oedipus thought that he was great enough, blasphemous enough, courageous enough to defeat it, he would stay home and say, I'm Oedipus. No fate is going to limit me. Mom, dad, pass the moussaka. I'm not going anywhere. And of course, the tragedy is they're not actually his mother and father. His parents heard the same prophecy, and they also tried to undo it. So he's living with foster parents and doesn't know it. By contrast, if he were cowardly or paralyzed by religion or fearful, he would say, what could somebody like me do against an oracle? There's no way I can escape my fate. And he would stay home, say, Mom, Dad, pass the macaroni and cheese, and he would have avoided his fate. But Oedipus is this and that. That's the heart of all Greek tragedy. He's this, that is, he is fearful that the prophecy is actually true and will defeat him. And he's that. He's courageous enough, blasphemous enough, heroic enough to try to beat it. And it's the combination that kills him, that destroys him, not just kills him, but brings his fate. The thisness and thatness is what makes it. And with Newland, he has some of this and some of that, but it doesn't rise, in my view, to the level of tragedy. It's very somber and very sad, and again, strikes that note on the author's part of sympathy for a half-led life, and for a life that I believe she thinks she could have been victim to if it wasn't for becoming a writer.
I don't see any more raised hands or questions, Mark. So you still have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, so let me say something else, because I to do justice to this novel in an hour, it's hard to pick out passages of description. Again, I'm always happy to welcome people who haven't ever read the book, who don't intend to read the book. But I will say that this is one of those novels that if you like good literary fiction, character portrayal, and also a sense of place and decor, I don't say that lightly. Edith Wharton was an interior decorator and wrote books about it. And this was an important part of the culture of that society. I do recommend you read the book. I'll say something else about this idea of being saved by being a writer. And I'll do this by previewing the 3 books we're going to do in the spring. As Kate correctly said, we're taking January and December and January off. And then in February, we're going to do James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, a nonfiction work. It's really 2 essays, one of which is a letter to his nephew that was the model for Ta-Nehisi Coates' more recent book, Between the World and Me, where roughly Coates, the same age as Baldwin was when Baldwin wrote his letter to his nephew in the 60s, Coates writes a letter to his son in the 21st century. In The Fire Next Time, one of the things that Baldwin says about the fate that's waiting for him in Harlem is that he saw that it was very hard to imagine there was much of a divide between his life and the life of crime. And so in order to avoid what he saw on the streets of Harlem, he joined the church, became a preacher in Black church, a kind of Pentecostal church. And then as he grew older, more mature and more knowledgeable about racial relations, he was courted by Elijah Muhammad for the Nation of Islam. And he describes in the letter to his nephew a dinner where he's basically being recruited by Elijah Muhammad. And when Elijah Muhammad says sort of, what side are you on? I'm paraphrasing here. Baldwin says, I'm a writer. And what he means by that is, I'm not partisan, I'm not political in the way that you want me to be, but I am a Black man who takes these issues seriously, and I am trying to cleanse the world like the flood through water, because I'm fearful that if this doesn't work, there will be, as the title of the book shows, the fire next time. And he proposes in the course of that book that people with imagination might actually be able to save the world. People who write is what they're called, ironically, by Edith Wharton. That's how the Great Society think of writers. But he knows that what a writer can do that other people can't do is imagine the thing that's not. And so we're going to read The Fire Next Time, short nonfiction. I urge you, if you do read it, for the session. And again, you're always welcome to come without reading. And of course, you're welcome to read and not come. This is still America, ladies and gentlemen. But I urge you to read it slowly, even though it's short, because always good nonfiction, there's both the substance and the style. And then in March, we're turning to one of Virginia Woolf's several masterpieces, Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, her reaction to the First World War, her answer to James Joyce in writing a single-day novel set in June in a European city, hers is London, and as I said, one of several masterpieces of hers. And then because April is both National Poetry Month and, according to T.S. Eliot, the cruelest month, that's the opening line of The Wasteland, we're going to be reading two of his best poems written in the early part of his career, around on either side of 1920, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, one of the great masterpieces of modernism, and a poem about Gerontion, capital Gerontion, a Greek word for old man. You can see gerontology in it. So a poem about a young man and a poem about an old man. Those are the two poems we're going to do in April. And so at the end of this kind of anthology course, we will have read fiction and nonfiction, poetry, a mystery novel. We'll have done works by women and men. We will have done works by Brits and Americans. And that's not a bad deal for half a dozen sessions. With thanks to Kate and Rick, who's her invisible roadie, making this happen, and to the Greenwich Library for inviting us all together on a cold November evening. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all our wonderful attendees. As I mentioned earlier, we will see you again in February. And if you would like to see recording of this program, it will be posted on Greenwich Library YouTube channel at some point next week. Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much.
Me too.